Good evening and welcome. My name is David Wood. I'm the Special Projects Manager for Early Music America, and we want to thank you for joining us for our interest session with members of Seven Times Salt this evening, Pilgrims Progress, Creating Music for the Plymouth Settlers. Before we get to introductions and the session this evening, I just want to run through how to contribute during this session. We'll be asking you to use the Q&A function. You'll find that button at the bottom of the Zoom screen if you're joining us via Zoom, and you'll put your questions into the box that comes up there for Q&A, and that will help us sort through and make sure that we don't have duplicates and all that kind of thing and keep track of that. We'll be using the chat for technical help or to interact with others who are in the Zoom session. And if there comes a time when we will be asking for spoken responses, we'll ask you to use that raise hand if that comes up. This is one of the programs of Early Music America, our interest sessions and webinars. You can find out more about the programs of Early Music America and our service to the field of early music in North America at earlymusicamerica.org. You can also find us on social media at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and on our YouTube channel, where this interest session will be archived along with the rest of the interest sessions and webinars that we have held over the past year, many of which in the last 6 months or so. And if you would like to find out more about EMA through our newsletter, you can sign up by texting Early Music to 42828 or use the button that you can find at the bottom of earlymusicamerica.org. And of course, we always invite anyone who wants to help support the field of early music in North America to join EMA or renew your membership if that membership has happened to lapse, or you can also donate to the programs of Early Music America. That's all at earlymusicamerica.org. So I would like to begin by welcoming our presenters this evening, two members of Seven Times Salt. Seven Times Salt has been active for the past 17 years and has brought music of the 16th and 17th centuries to life for their audiences with a special focus on English consort rep, praised for creative programming and impeccably balanced sound. That was by American Recorders Society. Seven Times Salt has performed at venues throughout New England, and they delight in blurring the lines between art music and folk music, and they feel at ease performing in the concert hall, the dance hall, or the beer hall. Our two presenters this evening are Karen Burciaga and Dan Meyers. Karen is a graduate of Vanderbilt University and the Longy School of Music. She's a Baroque violinist and viol player, viola da gamba. She also studied historical dance at Longy School, and she has performed with other period ensembles in New England and Texas, and is also a founding member of Seven Times Salt. Karen has been on the faculty of the Texas Toot, workshops by the Viola da Gamba Society of New England and the Pinewoods Dance Camp. And a lifelong love of Irish music led Karen into the world of fiddling and folk dance during college when she discovered Scottish, Irish, English, and contra styles. She's also the fiddler for the Celtic band Ulster Landing and has occasionally been spotted trying to play the harp. Multi-instrumentalist Dan Meyers credits range from premieres of new chamber music to headlining a concert series in honor of Pete Seeger at the Newport Folk Festival, to playing Renaissance instruments on Broadway as part of the band for Shakespeare's Globe. In recent seasons, he's appeared with the Folger Consort, the Newberry Consort, the 21st Century Consort, the Boston Shawm and Sackbut Ensemble, Early Music New York, and many, many others. He's the director of Early Wind Studies for the Five Colleges Early Music Program and has taught recorder and Renaissance winds for the Early Music Week at Pinewoods and at Tufts University. He also performs Southern Italian folk music with the band Nupoli and traditional Irish music with the bands Ulster Landing and Ishna. He also holds degrees from Longy School of Music as well as Whitman College. We'd like to welcome Dan and Karen this evening. And in just a moment here, I think everybody's coming on board here. And we will be happy to turn everything over to them. I will remind you that if you're interested, you can find out more about Seven Times Salt. They'll have their website up during the program, and you can also find out about their CD that is related to this particular program that we're talking about this evening, Pilgrims Progress. So Karen and Dan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, Dan gets our PowerPoint started. I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Karen, and I am the violinist, or sometimes fiddler, for Seven Times Salt, which, as David mentioned, is an early music group here in Boston. And let's see, do we have the music ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready when you are.
Sure, go ahead. We're going to start off with just a little clip of music for you, and then we'll talk after that. A little bit of a tune called Nutmegs and Ginger in a setting for English consort, and we'll actually come back to that in just a moment. This evening, my colleague Dan and I are going to take a look at the process of creating a concert program around a historical topic for which very little musical evidence exists. And as our example, we'll use Pilgrims Progress, a concert program that Seven Times Salt created about 15 years ago and is quite topical this year, being the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower sailing. A couple of years ago, we were fortunate enough to record the album in the 1717 Meetinghouse on Cape Cod, which is an amazing structure, a historic meeting house that's been used continuously for over 300 years. So we were really lucky to be able to go and play this music there. And as David mentioned, our CD is for sale, but we'll talk more about that at the end. The program imagines a musical backdrop for the Mayflower passengers, starting with their time in a turbulent England of the 1590s, on to religious refuge in the Netherlands, and finally on to their challenging new lives in New England in 1620. Now, of course, we can't know exactly which songs or dances the average 17th century English separatist might have known. And since many or most of them were illiterate, which is entirely normal for the period, we can't rely on their own words to help us. We do have the writings of a few educated men to guide us. William Bradford's History of the Journey and Early Plymouth Plantation, Edward Winslow's brief descriptions of his travels, but not much else. We wanted to be both historically accurate, but also create a compelling program to listen to and to engage with. So we knew we would need a large dose of creativity. Where did we start? Well, we do know that the roughly 50 or so separatists aboard the Mayflower brought a copy of Henry Ainsworth's Psalter, or a book of psalm texts, aboard with them. A copy is listed in the inventory of William Brewster's possessions. And just a quick note of clarification, I should say, the English separatists wanted to separate from their church, from the Church of England, reflected in their name Separatists, and worship in their own way, which was illegal at the time. And in 1608, a small group of them from the village of Scrooby in the north of England fled to Holland to find religious freedom. Separatists are different from Puritans, who wanted to purify the church from within but remain part of it. So I just wanted to explain that. I think history has conflated Pilgrims and Puritans, but they're actually different groups of people. So back to the Psalter. The Ainsworth Psalter formed the seed of our research. We asked ourselves, what other music might they have known? What music could the non-separatist passengers have been familiar with? Those from towns such as, from London and from many other towns throughout England and Holland. Fortunately, as most of you are probably aware, a lot of musical sources exist from that time. And besides the Psalter, there were two other music books brought on board. the Psalms of David, set for voices and instruments by Richard Allison, and a secular collection, The Golden Garland, full of broadside ballads that were collected and published by Richard Johnson. Besides those, we also looked at Ravenscroft's volumes of catches and part songs that were published in 1609 and 1611. Most of them very easy to read, but more importantly, very easy to learn by ear. We went ahead and made the assumption that for people who can't read words, they probably couldn't read music either. It might not have been true for all of them, but it was a basic assumption that we made. We also played through the consort lessons of Thomas Morley, published in 1599, a tumultuous time for the church and just a few years before the Scrooby congregation fled to Holland. We looked at the plays of Shakespeare, so many of which refer to popular tunes of the time, and we looked at works of composers such as Jacob van Eyck, who grew up not far from the separatist temporary home in Leiden. We dove into Playford's English Dancing Master, published in 1651, but containing beloved tunes that date back decades, if not a century. And we even composed an original tune for a 17th century text, and you'll hear more about that later. So our goal over the next 40 minutes or so is to illustrate each of these sources and tell you about the decisions we ended up making to both honor the historical record and put together an entertaining concert. So here you see the cover of Thomas Morley's collection, the first book of consort lessons from 1599. This collection was groundbreaking at the time in that it specified 6 particular instruments on which the music was to be played in a combination known as the English consort. The 6 instruments were the treble viol or violin, the bass viol, the flute, the lute, a cittern, and a bandora. And the piece you heard at the very beginning, Nutmegs and Ginger, comes from a cousin collection to this, the Cambridge consort books. And those survive without the violin or the bandora books. The scholars have reconstructed the bandora part as well as the violin part, and the violin melody can also be found in other sources, although it's also tempting to see what the violinist might make up in the moment. So this really presented our first challenge. Here you see the flute and bandora parts from Morley's set, except it's missing the lute book. Now, we're lucky to have reconstructed parts for almost all of this, but to take it one step further, our lutenist, Matt Wright, decided to compose his own divisions for this piece, Join Hands. And these consort lessons, as they were called, were really meant for home practice and amateur rather than professional musicians. So we took a leap and we envisioned settler Edward Winslow, who was a man of good education and, who knows, perhaps some musical training, practicing his lute in his rooms at the King's School in Worcester. So here's a little bit of Join Hands.
So Karen mentioned some of the musicology work that we had to do just to develop performable editions of this music for the concert. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we developed our aesthetic for presenting this program. Like many groups involved in 21st century historical performance, we found over the years that multimedia concerts, involving readings, iconography, and even audience participation sometimes, almost always enhance the appreciation of the music. But at the same time, it's a delicate balance between giving the music a coherent narrative and making the concert more about history than it is about music. And for this program, we determined that the best way to strike that balance was to create our own invented original journal entries based on the style of primary sources, but reflecting subject matter that enhances our chosen narrative by focusing on the everyday activities of the Plymouth settlers. As Karen mentioned earlier, there are a few extant primary sources describing the Plymouth colony in the 1620s, including Mort's Relation, which you'll see there on the left, which is a compendium of accounts from various settlers, Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, and you can see Bradford's lovely legible handwriting on the right there. That's from Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. And then also Edward Winslow's Good News from New England. And these are certainly valuable historical documents, but unfortunately they leave out what to us is the most interesting part of the Plymouth story. Winslow and Bradford were upper-class Englishmen and well-educated. Bradford's manuscript includes notes in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, as well as English. And while it's fortunate for posterity that there were such literate individuals among the Plymouth settlers, they were not very representative of the larger Plymouth population. As Karen said, most of them were farmers and tradesmen and couldn't read or write. Also, the concerns of writers like Bradford and Winslow as chroniclers of the Pilgrims were primarily political or theological rather than social. So faced with this dilemma and with this lack of day-to-day information about what the average Plymouth settler might have experienced, we decided that our best course of action would be to read between the lines and create our own plausible narrative voice for the majority of Plymouth settlers who were unable to document their day-to-day lives, in much the same way that Shakespeare took artistic license with the private lives of 14th and 15th century English monarchs in his histories. The language and the style of these fictitious journal entries is drawn largely from Winslow, Bradford, and their contemporaries, including Thomas Morton, a delightful fellow who we'll discuss in a few minutes. The content, however, is entirely ours. We made it up, aside from the mention of a few concrete historical events and a general knowledge of the Pilgrims' circumstances in England and the Netherlands before reaching the New World. To inform this fictional content, we have a few aids besides the primary sources mentioned earlier. First, we have the lyrics and subject matter of 17th century music, which tells us much about what the Plymouth settlers might have found entertaining. Second, we have Karen's invaluable experience as a historical interpreter at Plymouth Plantation, where she worked living the life of a 17th century settler day in and day out. And finally, we have our own experience as 21st century humans and musicians living in New England. And of course, this has undoubtedly resulted in the inclusion of some small anachronisms in the journal entries, regardless of the amount of research we've done. But we hope that whatever anachronisms have crept in, whatever bit of our personality have crept into these, hopefully help us bridge the gap between the worldview of the Plymouth colony settlers and the experiences of a modern concert audience. Because as we all know, no matter how authentic we might try to be, the one thing that will never be the same as the original performance of early music is the audience. The audience is always modern. So now you'll hear one of our invented journal entries used in a standardized, read in a standardized OP, or original pronunciation. This is also called Early Modern English, and it's sort of our house style, developed from a synthesis of various dialects and pronunciations used in 17th century England. And in fact, most of the singing and the readings on the album are done in that OP. So this is one of the invented journal entries from a fictitious future Plymouth colony settler circa about 1610.
'Tis difficult to believe that I am now to leave the city where I have dwelt for all of my 21 years. This morning I stand upon the docks with a sore head and a light purse, awaiting the tide that I might sail for Leiden, with only the memory of last night's pleasant diversions to speed me on my way. Trade for our little company has sadly declined in these times, and it is said that the Dutch merchant companies will pay a fair wage to any Englishman who will venture his fortunes upon a Dutch vessel. For my part, though, I will sorely miss the entertainments of the alehouses and playhouses of London. Yesterday we saw another fine play by Mr. Shakespeare. It was well spoken by all, and the music the sweetest I have yet heard, with many a delightful air played upon the lutes, viols, and divers other instruments. Though my fortunes now lie in Holland, I doubt I will find such entertainments there as I leave behind me in London town.
So that was the mellifluous and historically accurate voice of Michael Barrett, the tenor here in Boston, with whom we collaborate frequently. He's a wonderful singer, also a talented lutenist and recorder player, and he agreed, along with several of our other colleagues, to do the readings of these journal entries for the album. So now we're going to move on a little bit to story and history, specifically the part of the program that is set in Holland. And as Karen mentioned, there was a specific congregation from Scrooby in Nottinghamshire that spent a decade in Holland after leaving England to avoid religious persecution. And they were in the town of Leiden. As we worked to select music for the Leiden portion of our Pilgrim's journey, in some ways we had even more freedom than in the English parts of the program, since none of the pastor, John Robinson's writing, the pastor of this congregation, or anyone else's for that matter, mentioned what the English separatists might have heard in the Netherlands in terms of music. We wanted to tell a convincing story of the English experience in Leiden, though, and we knew from contemporary sources that the Leiden of the 16 teens was a very cosmopolitan town, probably to a degree that frightened the somewhat sheltered English expats. Scrooby at the time was a village of only about 150 people, and Leiden was a town of over 40,000. It was also a town where printed books and music abounded. It was the center of the Dutch printing industry at the time in the early 17th century. And so we wanted to create a musical set filled with sort of this novelty and wonder that we think might have been inspired in the English settlers, but also with some sadness, since the Englishmen in Leiden did not have it easy. By Dutch law, they were forbidden from holding most jobs other than manual labor positions. A lot of them worked in factories or textile mills or did other hard manual work. And also, since the voyage to the New World in 1620 meant a necessary split in the Leiden Pilgrim community, because there weren't enough funds available to send everyone to New England at once. And in fact, some of the Scrooby expats never left Leiden, but lived the rest of their lives there and raised their children as Dutch citizens. Some of their descendants live in Leiden to this day. So in selecting music for this part of the program, we accepted some necessary small distortions of timelines and cultural references. And I'll be a little bit more specific about that. So here is something that any recorder players in the audience may recognize. This is from Jacob van Eyck's De Fluiten Lusthof, The Flute's Pleasure Garden. It is the largest collection of music for a solo unaccompanied wind instrument in history to this day, published in 1646. But of course, it's not 1646 yet. So in 1620, the heyday of our English settlers, Jacob van Eyck was still living in the small Dutch town of Houston, which was about 100 kilometers from Leiden. And he had not yet taken the position of organist and caroller in Utrecht, where he became famous for his recorder improvisations. Nevertheless, we felt that the bird-like English nightingale, which you see part of here, would have impressed and delighted the Scrooby settlers, some of whom had likely heard the popular tune, The Nightingale, which was very new, or maybe even not quite written yet, at the time that they traveled to Leiden. Now, it's highly unlikely that Van Eyck ever performed in Leiden, or that the English settlers would have traveled as far as Houston to hear him play. But who knows what similarly virtuosic music they might have heard in their extremely diverse neighborhood near the Peterskirk, which included French Anabaptists, Sephardic Jews, Ottoman Muslims, and a melting pot of other nationalities and ethnicities. So here's a bit of Van Eyck. So just the beginning of the Van Eyck there. So in similar fashion, in 1620, the young Tarquinio Merola had most likely not yet written his sonata La Gallina, or the Hen, which would later be published in the 1646 Dutch collection Nederland Cabinet, or the Useful Collection, which you can see the frontispiece of here. And in the Dutch version, it was published under the title Tanne en Hennegekraai, or the Rooster and the Cackling of the Hens. But we couldn't resist the combination of barnyard animals and Italian sonata style, which was all the rage in the Low Countries in the early part of the 17th century. Italian sonata style, not barnyard animals, although those were probably popular in the 17th century too. So here is a little sample of the Dutch publication of this Italian sonata with additional birdiness furnished by Seven Times Salt. So in our Dutch set, we did not choose to exclusively select pieces about birds. We actually end the set with a ballad, Nu dobbert mijn liefje op de ree, which means Now My Love's Leaving on the Waves. It's a theater song by the Dutch poet and playwright G.A. Brederode. And this was exactly of the right time. It was undoubtedly written and published during the years the Pilgrims spent in Leiden. However, Brederode was in Amsterdam, and it's unlikely, in addition to the distance between Leiden and Amsterdam, that the conservative separatist churchgoers of Scrooby would have traveled that far, or even really across the street, in order to see a play. Nevertheless, when we heard the song, we felt that it almost perfectly portrayed the anguish that the English community in Leiden must have felt, as some of them left for the New World while others stayed behind. We also felt that it was important to include a song in Dutch, since about half of the English separatists who first arrived in Leiden in 1609 never left, as I mentioned earlier, and they are still to this day part of the rich international tapestry of the Low Countries. So here is just one verse of this long ballad about being parted by the waves.
Det alles kunst, die dort die Lüg sein Liv kon drachen, ich soll auch leiden mit mein Kunst, mein warste Liv, mein Wohlbehagen, war ich ons lachend van Tlotz ich Fleiß, drache mein Geest rot met u op de reis, nu doet het mijn gepijns.
As the Scrooby congregation was settling into life in the Netherlands, in 1612, Henry Ainsworth published his original translations of the Psalms along with a customary tune for each of them. It was printed in Amsterdam specifically for the fugitive separatists living in Holland at the time. The Psalter contains a unique mix of styles. Ainsworth wrote that each people is to use the most comfortable manner of singing that they know. The singing notes, therefore, I have most taken from our former Englished psalms. And for the other long verses, I've also taken the gravest and easiest tunes of the French and Dutch psalms. In separatist worship, only the unison tune was sung, no harmony parts in worship. So here we really had to use our best judgment. psalms aren't really meant for performance, certainly not concert performance, so they don't really belong in a concert setting. But we felt that it was important to paint this musical picture of the colonists' worship. So we decided to pair Ainsworth's new translation of the 100th Psalm, which you see on the left, along with its tune, which is probably familiar to a lot of you, with John Dowland's four-part harmonization on the right, which comes from the Whole Book of Psalms of 1592, printed by Thomas East. Now, certainly the so-called strangers, as William Bradford called the non-separatists of the group, may have been familiar with these harmonizations from their own church going, and who knows, maybe even the plain and simple separatists might have sung in harmony in their homes or at work in the field. So now we'll hear Psalm 100.
Shout to Jehovah the earth, serve ye Jehovah with gladness, before him come with singing mirth. Know that Jehovah he good is. 'Tis he that made us and not we, his folk and sheep of his feeding. Oh, with confession enter ye, his gates, his courtyards with praising. Confess to him, bless ye his name, because Jehovah he good is. His mercy ever is the same, and his faith unto all ages.
Now, the history books might have led us to believe that the Pilgrims were quite a dour bunch, but it's not true. Remember, they're not Puritans, and even that stereotype of the Puritan in somber black who shuns dancing, drinking, and all forms of fun isn't correct to begin with, not entirely correct, and it belongs to a different group of people at a later time in a different place anyway. While it's true worship did last most of the day on Sundays, and everyone, separatist or not, was required to attend church, and although their work as farmers and fishermen must have been never-ending and exhausting, they most certainly would have found time to sing or whistle, sport, or even dance on occasion, although co-ed dancing was not allowed, at least not officially. So when it comes to the popular music of 17th century England, as distinct from formal church or court music, we are very fortunate that there are a lot of good printed sources available from that time period. One that we're very fond of is, as I mentioned, John Playford's English Dancing Master, which contains many popular tunes along with their dance steps, as you see here, and was published in numerous editions between 1651 and 1728, almost an 80-year run. These simple tunes offer us a chance to exercise our creative and compositional muscles. In real life, they're meant to be played many, many, many times over for people actually dancing to the music, not just listening to it. So presenting a dance tune to an audience takes some thought. How do we best bring a tune to life? One solution could be to look at period arrangements of these tunes, which do exist sometimes, or to try to compose our own multi-part settings in a period style. And both of those options, while certainly valid, can come out sounding too busy or too courtly, a little too fussy for what we're looking for, since we want a rustic, straightforward sound in this New World section of our program. But we are fortunate that English dance is actually a living tradition here in New England through its descendant contra dance that has been danced here for centuries and is now popular across the country. And also, the revival of traditional English dance itself allows us to dance with and play with real people in real life at dances, and that's really an invaluable experience. So here we opted for a partially improvised performance, drawing on folk tradition, which we hope offers a spontaneous feel of the dance. We try to keep the harmonies simple, and we use a driving sort of rhythm section feel in the lute and the bass viol. Because the tune goes through repetitions, we sort of allow it to evolve naturally each time, varying orchestration as we go, maybe even outlining a sort of story, and it's guaranteed to be a little bit different each time. So here you will hear one of our versions of the dance tune Grimstock. As we continued to imagine daily life in Plymouth Colony, it seemed unthinkable that its inhabitants wouldn't have sung simple rounds or whistled familiar tunes in addition to singing psalms, although of course we have no proof. But if we assume that people are people and like to entertain themselves, we sort of ran with the idea and just chose some of our favorite rounds and country dances. So our next example comes from Thomas Ravenscroft's collection Deuteramelia of 1609, the year that the Scrooby group fled first to Amsterdam, then moving to Leiden. It contains, as he describes it, pleasant roundelays and delightful catches. And nearly every piece is very simple, quickly learned, and a lot of fun to sing. In this case, rather than having each singer cycle through all three parts as you normally do in a round, we instead decided to assign one part per singer, turning it into a part song and allowing each voice to play up its own character in this very boisterous drinking song. And as is typical for 7 Times Salt, we quickly added some unusual percussion, some questionable guitar playing, and a good dose of humor. We can only hope that Ravenscroft himself would approve. So here is Of All the Birds.
Ever I see, the owl is the fairest in her degree, for all the day long she sits in a tree, and when the night comes away flies she. To wit, to whom drinkst thou?
Sir knave, to thou.
This song is well sung, and I'll make you a vow, and 'tis a knave that drinketh now. To wit, to whom drinkst thou?
Sir knave, to thou.
This song is well sung, and I'll make you a vow, and 'tis a knave that drinketh now. Nose, 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 and who gave me that jolly red nose? Cinnamon and ginger, nothing can close, and that gave thee that jolly red nose. Nose, 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 and who gave thee that jolly red nose? Cinnamon and ginger, nothing can close, and that gave thee that jolly red nose.
Sir knave to thou.
The songs well sung and I'll make you all bow, and he is a knave that drinketh now. To wit, to whom drinks thou?
Sir knave to thou.
The song is well sung and I'll make you all bow, and he is a knave that drinketh now. Nose, 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 and who gave thee thy jolly red nose? Cinnamon and ginger, nothing that goes, and that gave thee thy jolly red nose. Nose, 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 and who gave thee thy jolly red nose? Cinnamon and ginger, nothing that goes, and that gave thee thy jolly red nose.
I still have to laugh every time I hear that. I think we had to do at least 3 extra takes during the recording session because various members of the group cracked up at Matt's interpretation of cinnamon and ginger. It's still funny. One of our great other discoveries while putting this program together was the book New English Canaan by Thomas Morton. And this is definitely not a book you would have heard about while learning the story of the first Thanksgiving in school. A very colorful character, as you'll hear in a moment, Morton allowed us to look at the Pilgrims in a new light, since he wrote about them from an outsider's perspective, and he wasn't at all hesitant to criticize what he saw as their mistakes or their exaggerated sense of self-importance. Morton came to New England a few years after the Plymouth colonists in 1624, and along with Richard Wollaston, an English sea captain whose name will sound familiar if you're a Massachusetts resident, he started a small trading colony on the site of what we now know as Quincy, Massachusetts, about 15 miles south of Boston. Although the colony was originally called Mount Wollaston, Morton, who was an abolitionist before it was fashionable, became furious when he found out that Wollaston had been facilitating the transfer of slaves to tobacco plantations in Virginia. And he encouraged the residents of Mount Wollaston to actually rise up and overthrow Wollaston and become a self-governing community. Morton was a charismatic leader, and they did just that. In 1626, Richard Wollaston fled to Virginia with a few of his supporters, and Morton and the remaining residents renamed the colony, Merrymount. Unlike the Plymouth colonies, Morton traded freely with the native Massachusetts tribe, including supplying them with liquor, and encouraged members of the Merrymount settlement to intermarry with the Native Americans, certainly not something that was looked on favorably by the Plymouth settlers. As a native of the West Country in England, he was fond of many of the old pagan agrarian celebrations, including the tradition of the maypole. And in New English Canaan, he writes about one particular celebration where a maypole 80 feet tall was erected, and the English and Native Americans alike feasted and reveled together. Along with the eating and drinking, Morton says, there was likewise a merry song made, which, to make their revels more fashionable, was sung with a chorus, every man bearing his part, which they performed in a dance, hand in hand about the maypole, whiles one of the company sung and filled out the good liquor, like Gametes and Jupiter. The words of this song, which Morton probably wrote himself, delighted us so much and worked as such a perfect counterpoint to the sometimes obnoxious piety of the Plymouth settlers that we knew we had to include it in the concert, even though there was no extant music for it. So our lutenist, Matt Wright, quickly wrote a tune for it, and we arranged it as a rowdy Morris dance coom drinking song for the ensemble. So here is our version of Drink and Be Merry, Boys. We like to imagine it accompanying a great deal of enthusiastic co-ed dancing.
Then drink and be merry, merry boys. Let all delight in Imon's joys. To Imon now the day is come, about the merry maple take a rum. Make green garlands, bring bottles out, and fill sweet nectar freely about. Uncover thy head and fear no harm, for here's good liquor, keep it warm. Then drink and be merry, merry boys. Let all delight in Imon's joys. To Imon now the day is come, about the merry maple take a rum. Nectar is the thing assigned by the deity's own mind, to cure the heart oppressed with grief and of good liquors is the chief.
Then drink merry, merry boys, they all delight in Hyman's joys. To Hyman now the day is come, about the merry maid will take our own.
Give to the melancholy man a cup or two off now and then. This physic will soon revive his mood and make him be of merrier mood.
And drink merry, merry boys, they all delight in Hyman's joys. To Hyman now the day is come, about the merry maid will take our own.
Give to the nymph that's free from scorn, no Irish stout nor Scotch or worn. Lasses in beaver coats come away. You're welcome to us night and day.
And drink merry, merry boys, let all delight in Hyman's joys. To Hyman now the day is come, about the merry maid will take our own. And drink merry, merry boys, let all delight in Hyman's joys. To Hyman now the day is come, about the merry maid will take our own.
Well, on that very festive note, we are coming to the end of our story here. William Bradford's chronicle of early Plymouth ends in 1650, as does our concert program. And I hope that our whirlwind journey through the Mayflower Passengers musical world and also our process of creating it has been of interest. Before I forget, I should make good on my promise. So the CD, Pilgrims Progress, is available for sale through our website, which is 7timesalt.com. You see it there on the screen. And I might also be able to type it into the chat. We would love to hear from you, and at the end, if we run out of time for questions, you are welcome to contact us there as well. So 7timesalt.com. I want to thank Early Music America for having us this evening, and David for all of his help. I also want to give a quick shout out to the other musicians that you heard in the presentation this evening, our bandmates Matt Wright and Joshua Schreiber-Shalem. You also heard Michael Barrett, as Dan mentioned, Mark Rimple, and Nathaniel Cox. So thank you to all of them. And I think with David's help, we will move to some questions now.
Yeah, so firstly, thank you both so much. What a wonderful, incredibly expansive program that you've come up with and been able to share with us in this way. And as people submit any questions that you might have, I just have a few questions to get the ball rolling a little bit. So obviously, this project involved lots of research, composing and arranging, and then plenty of creativity. How do you pass that around within the ensemble? Do you have individuals who have specific areas that you take, or do you just do it as a full group sort of approach?
I think each of us sort of naturally gravitates towards certain things. We don't have roles necessarily that we need to fulfill. In this case, it was kind of lopsided because I was the one who had worked at Plymouth Plantation and had all this music going around in my head. So I think in this case, I did a lot of it. Full credit to Dan for coming up with the idea of the invented journal entries. He said, you know what, why don't we tell their story in words? I'll write them. I was like, great, you write those. And, and we added it in. And then, you know, of course, as we said, Matt took it upon himself. He found the Morton book, found that text and said, you know what, I think we need to include this. I will write a tune for it. And so, you know, it's definitely a collaborative process.
That's great. What do you think was maybe one of the most enjoyable things about putting this project together?
Well, I mean, this is sort of our second time around with this project. It was our first concert program that we ever put together. So this was originally conceived in 2004. And we performed it several times, but didn't record it. And then a couple of years ago, we came around to the idea of recording it. Karen had gotten in touch with the people at the 1717 Meetinghouse in Barnstable on Cape Cod, which is the oldest continuous congregation. Their congregation boasts 400 years of continuity. While the church was built in 1717, the congregation actually came over as a group from England, and they had been worshiping together since about 1617. So it was a fantastic, wonderful historic site to record it in, and things just sort of like
really atmospheric, like almost creepy in a good way, but just being in that setting really meant a lot.
And then we had, some fortunate serendipities in our colleagues volunteered to go ahead and do the readings, to be coached in OP, in early modern English, and to read these crazy journal entries that I wrote. And then other things like we asked Sarah Mead to produce it, who many of you will be familiar with, a viol player and musicologist. And she wrote back and she's like, well, interestingly enough, I'm actually descended from Pastor John Robinson. So I think that's a sign that I should be involved in this project. So then she signed on as producer, and everything just sort of, we had a lot of happy serendipity in the putting together of the recording. So.
And then I think for me also, because we've lived with this program and this repertoire for so long, especially this year, sort of coming up to the big anniversary, it's been really fulfilling to me to see that people are so interested in it. They really want to hear this and they want to know more. So I've really enjoyed the chance to sort of bring it back to life again, and share it with new people.
Well, that kind of brings up one of a question that we have that someone has submitted, that they said, they've noticed, obviously, this has been something you've been living with for a very long time, and you've presented it at a variety of venues. So they were curious as to how much your performance and presentation has varied from audience to audience. Have you been making changes? Do you mostly keep it the same?
I'd say there's sort of two different formats that have kind of coalesced on their own. One is what I would call the kind of normal concert format. So it's all music interspersed with those fictional entries. So the whole thing is kind of a performance. We're kind of setting, the whole hour takes place in long ago times. We also, over the past couple of years, because it seemed like a good thing to do, we also came up with a lecture demo version. So more emphasis on describing the history and talking about the Mayflower passengers from our current perspective, and then filling that in with music as we go. So I don't know, that's probably not a huge difference, but we kind of have those two different formats. Is that what you would say, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, there were some pieces that changed, as with any time you revisit a concert program, especially one that you've done years before. When we were actually looking at rebooting this, there were some things that we had done, 14 or 15 years ago that we were like, yeah, maybe we won't do that. And then there were some things that we added, and then some things that just, sprung up out of nowhere, like having a jaw harp solo, which I'm still not sure was a good idea. But it's the only time I've ever recorded a jaw harp solo, so it's unique in my experience. But yeah, I think there was definitely some editing throughout the process, and the program did evolve a little bit from 2004 to 2020, both in terms of music and in terms of how we presented it. So.
And you talked just there about before about how people have sort of an increased interest in this right now because of the anniversary. But what has the audience reaction been to either formats of those? But just overall to this to the program, what have people said to you afterwards? How are they receiving it?
I feel like we've heard a number of questions from people who may already know a lot of the history, but not necessarily the music. And so people will come up after performance. I remember at the 1717 Meetinghouse, actually, after we recorded it, we also performed it. And people came up and they just wanted to know how had we found the music, which is kind of the topic that, we were going over tonight. And so it can be hard to condense that much information into the polite post-concert answer of, oh, well, we looked here and here and here and here, and we did this and this and everything. And eventually they sort of wander off. But I think it's great that it sparks people's interest. And I think the music is definitely helpful in bringing the history off the page. That's a phrase that may get overused, but it's really true. People might know about the Mayflower, about early Plymouth. They don't think about this other component necessarily. And so that's where we come in.
And people are often surprised. I've had people come up to us after concerts and they have believed that the journal entries were genuine, that they were actual, written in the 17th century. And they've also believed, which I think is even better, that they said, well, where did you find the actual attribution? Were they writing? Were there people who were writing about doing these specific dances or singing these specific songs? And to me, I think that's a good sign of success, that we made it plausible enough that people are going, oh, well, this, clearly they must have found in a library somewhere a book that described exactly what the, Plymouth settlers sang on, January 19th, 1621 or something like that. I wish it would be fantastic if we had something like that, but.
Yeah, but overall, quite a positive reaction, I think, just because it's a new facet that maybe not everyone is aware of. But of course, for us coming from early music land, it seems pretty natural. Like, of course, this is the music that was happening at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't oftentimes get to have music added into when we're in our elementary school classrooms and learning about the settlers and all that. Yeah, it's absolutely true. Absolutely. We had someone who asked a related question here, and they're saying, when you're creating a concert program, this one or other ones, where do you start from? And maybe you can talk about, because you mentioned, the connections of how sort of the germ of this, but they said, do you start with the music, historical setting and theme, or story? How do you start? And is there a way that you approach different programs, even outside of this one, with your ensemble?
In the interest of full disclosure, I have to say that almost every concert program we've ever developed started in a bar. It almost always involves us meeting for beers with big piles of music to discuss things. That's generally how it works. So,
but more seriously, I guess I'm trying to think of our other programs. I think a lot of what we do, I guess there's sort of two things. There's something focused on a historical event, such as our program about the English Civil War. So having a specific set of dates is already a big first step for us. If we know, all right, we're looking for music that someone plausibly could have heard or played or known about between the years A and B, that definitely narrows it down. And then as you start proceeding through, okay, location, what composers do we know, or what collections do we know that were published nearby? Or as Dan was saying earlier in our presentation today, can we bend the space-time continuum a little bit and be able to include it if it's good music? I think overall, there's always this balance of being historically accurate, but also picking the music that we want to play. So there's definitely a balance there. Other programs, I guess are more of a theme. For example, we have a fall harvest time program. So just diving into internet resources and the library and seeing what songs you can find from the 17th century about harvest and beer, for example. I guess there are a couple different ways to go about it, but we think for the most part, there's always some kind of theme, whether it's the historical event or a person or a specific time period that we want to portray.
Yeah, we always try and remain conscious of the fact that it is a performance. We are looking to involve and entertain people. And if we're including something just for, strictly for musicological interest, that doesn't appeal to us very much. The focus, not that we're not interested in doing the research, obviously we are, but the focus is still on engaging people. And if something is not, musically and creatively interesting in a way that we feel is going to engage the audience, then it doesn't usually make the cut.
Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit of a formula. There's always some number of English country dances or some kind of dance tune. A lot of our programs are English, so that's sort of what we gravitate towards. And there's almost always at least one, if not a handful of ballads with a chorus, or people can sing along, or there's room for improv and silliness, along with the composed artworks. It's almost always a mix of those genres.
Well, I'm going to put I put the link to the CD, and I'll just put a link straight to your website so others can find out about all of your programs and more about the ensemble and how to contact you if they want to learn more about that. We want to say thank you to both of you, Karen and Dan, and obviously also to the rest of your ensemble who aren't with us this evening, but who are so much involved in this program. Thank you for sharing this with us. It's enlightening. It was entertaining. We're really happy that you were able to present this program for us.
Great. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks a million for having us. Thanks to you and to EMA and to everybody who joined us tonight. We're really happy to do this in this forum specifically. So thanks again.
And this, as I mentioned earlier, we'll archive this interest session at our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/EMA Early Music America. You can also find links to that at earlymusicamerica.org, along with our many other past interest sessions. And you can find out about upcoming interest sessions as those get scheduled through our calendar and through the interest session and webinars page on our website. So once again, for Early Music America, thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll see you next time.